Welcome to Bad News Hughes. This is Don Hughes with your Canadian election update. Let's run through the parties. The Liberal Party is a public relations scam that plants trees around the mass grave that is Canadian history. Justin Trudeau is like if George W. Bush got in a kayaking accident and lost his intelligence and charisma. Just a total zero. These bourgeois sleazebags sell military gear to the Saud family regime and then call themselves humanitarians. Now, the Conservative Party is basically Canada's wing of the National Party in South Africa under apartheid. These twisted creeps are proud that Canada is a settler colony and won't have it any other way. The things Liberals pretend to be sad about, the Conservatives openly support. Their leader is Andrew Scheer, a man so bland that listening to him speak is like eating a box of crackers without a glass of water. The New Democratic Party, or NDP, has never led a federal government, but it's certainly run left-wing movements into the ground in a number of provinces. The NDP has a new leader in Jagmeet Singh, and the big question is whether Canadians are too racist to vote for someone with Punjabi heritage. That's the wrong question. Canadians are too racist to vote for anyone. We need a revolutionary committee to run the whole show. The Bloc Québécois starts with a great idea. We need to destroy Canada. Then they ruin it by saying Quebec still needs to exist. The whole idea sounds like a divorced dad. Quebec wants to keep imperialism on weekends. Next, the Green Party. The Greens are another public relations scam. Their slogan is not left, not right, but forward together. That's just textbook neo-Nazi third positionism. We're not fooled. The Green Party dreams of joining a coalition with the Liberals. It's like when you watch your garbage collector dump your recycling into the same bin as the trash. Then there's the People's Party, which is a half-assed attempt to start a new fascist party. Hey bozos, you already have 5 fascist parties to choose from. I just listed them. Let's talk issues. The NDP has promised a national pharmacare program, which makes sense in a country that supposedly has free healthcare. Unfortunately, they aren't planning on getting rid of the causes of all those symptoms. So you'll have to put on some Drake, take a handful of free painkillers, and cry yourself to sleep again. The Conservatives said they'll fix the housing crisis. Their brilliant idea is to let more people dive into high-risk mortgages. 10 years. It's only been 10 years since this idea nuked half the economy, and they're already back at it. Abolish landlords, problem solved. The Liberals, for their part, have promised to plant 2 billion trees. I said they promised trees earlier, but you probably didn't believe me. Look it up. They're promising trees. Now, the official Bad News Hughes election prediction. Here it is. Bourgeois democracy is a sham. You want my sample size? It's 500 years of colonialism. The workers need to turf this whole system and come up with something new. Mao was right. Without a people's army, the people have nothing. Goodbye.
Oh, God. We're recording. Well, that was well worth the wait for the long anticipated Donald Get Fiscal Chapo collaboration. We needed more of his teachings, and luckily he has his own podcast now.
Yes, called You Can't Win. Check it out.
You Can't Win. Oh, so that little intro is our way of letting you know that you've been clamoring for this for 350 plus episodes now, and we're finally doing it. It's a Canadian episode, eh?
Oh, yeah.
We're focused on our friends above the border. Did you guys know that America is actually not the only country in North America?
It's kind of crazy.
But there's a whole other country that's not even America.
Yeah, actually, there's several.
What?
Yeah. Mexico is technically part of North America,
No.
as are many of the countries in the Caribbean, and I think technically Central America as
Greenland is considered a part of North America.
Yeah.
That's why we're trying to buy it. Add it to the gang.
Apparently, Canada has their own government, which seems to me to be totally unnecessary and
That's
redundant.
just redundant. Yeah.
They should just have ours. Like, what a waste of time.
Donald just gave us the rundown. I mean, they're having an election
Coming up.
What the fuck? They're like bad scheduling to go up against, the biggest election in the world.
Exactly. And
ever.
you might say ours isn't for a year, but it's like, sorry, we have 2 year long presidential races. You need to schedule around that shit.
Dude, Beto just got on a skateboard.
I know.
Come on.
We just found out that Liz Warren is wilding out. Liz Warren is a fucking cougar in chief. How are we supposed to care about what some fucking syrup eaters do?
Well, that's just some of the people listening to the show. Most people want to watch the Super Bowl halftime show, and some people want the Puppy Bowl.
Well, to take a deeper dive into our friends up north, we are joined by Luke Savage. Luke, how's it going?
Hey guys, good. Thanks for having me. First time, long time.
What province are you calling in from today?
Province.
The beautiful province of Ontario, which I'm fairly certain is much of which is on the same longitude or latitude as New York State.
Okay, so that's the New York of Canada.
Is it daytime? Is it daytime or nighttime there?
It is. I'm in the same time zone as you guys.
What?
If all the liberal shitheads live in Toronto, what do you call them? Because you can't call them coastal elites. Great Lakes elites?
We actually have our own word for that. Close, Virgil. You call them Laurentian elites. That's the term.
Okay. What's the heartland?
Alberta, right? That's where the psycho.
I don't know what counts as the heartland. It might be the prairies.
Oh, they call it tundra, I think.
Technically, Ontario is part of Eastern Canada, which is funny because it's actually kind of in the middle.
But also, it's on the coast of one of the Great Lakes, right? Isn't Toronto?
Yeah, almost all of them.
Well, there you go. And the Great Lakes are the third coast.
You ever notice how Ontario looks like it's punching Michigan?
As well it should.
It's punching Detroit.
I don't want to open up our Canadian politics episode talking about American politics, but I have to. Matt already brought it up. Liz Warren sex trafficked a Marine. Luke Savage, your thoughts on this rapidly developing story?
I haven't heard about this. What's going on?
Okay, it's like turn on your television right now. Like it will be on every single channel.
Yeah. No, this is huge.
This is an absolute game changer.
This is a literal October surprise.
This is, of course, brought to us courtesy of friends of the show, Jack Burkman and Jacob Wohl.
The Duke and the Dauphin.
Yeah, the Duke and the Dauphin of the American, our current election, have held another just blockbuster press conference at Jack Burkman's apartment.
Coming right on the heels of another press conference where they said they had the identity of the leaker.
Yeah, and then they didn't do it.
And they said, but for reasons we can't tell you the identity.
Yeah.
Okay, so Luke, check this out. Wohl Burkman apartment press conference. They have found a young man, a former Marine, who was sex trafficked by Elizabeth Warren and did sex stuff to her. He compromised her pussy to a permanent end. And they brought him to this press conference.
Yeah.
This young man who proceeded to take off his shirt and show a scar from where Elizabeth Warren, this senator from Massachusetts, whipped him during various BDSM sex acts.
Yeah.
But more interestingly, he has a tattoo of Triple X from the film Triple X starring Vin Diesel.
One of them starred Ice Cube.
I mean, there's only one Triple X, Matt, and it's Vin Diesel. Okay,
the OG.
He has a Triple X tattoo.
Yeah.
And apparently could not read his part during the press conference without laughing.
Yeah.
But, we all process trauma in different ways.
Yeah.
But like I'm saying, I hope this earth-shattering news doesn't eclipse the very important stuff you're about to tell us about. Where are you from again?
Yeah, according to him, he was really deeply traumatized by all of this intense sex. A shout out to Twitter user Contrarian Takes, who sent me photographs of the document that they handed out, which is meant to look like a signed affidavit, even though, of course, it has no markings. It's not notarized. It is not. It's just a guy signing a piece of paper. But
it's like built on a Microsoft Word template.
Yes. No, it is. But he says, "quote Although I have a fair amount of experience in this business, he's basically a rent boy. He says he was picked up by Senator Warren from the website Cowboys for Angels." But he says, although I have a fair amount of experience in this business, I was shocked by the intensity, duration, and sheer violence of what Senator Warren wanted. So he was traumatized.
She's 70 years old.
But she's voracious. I don't know what this guy's complaining about. Liz Warren uses every inch of the pussy.
Matt, have you seen a clip of? Do we have a clip of his statement? Because I've read that he started laughing.
Yeah,
while
that's
reading
what I
this.
read.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any video. I've just seen
I'm
the
sure
photographs.
I'm sure we can rip a video later.
Yeah, we'll run up.
I had to spend time with an older woman many times before, but never a woman over 60. Nice. Although I was unaware of it at the time, Senator Warren wanted not just rough sex, but extensive BDSM play, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with, I'm sure.
I'm sorry to our guest Luke Savage. We do want to talk about Canadian politics, but
we will get to that.
We just had this is breaking news. This will change the course of history probably. Like I said, all I can think about is Liz Warren or Matt. You said this like popping open a shipping container like in The Wire season 2, and there's just 30 guys wearing like camo cut-off shirts,
no shirts, camo shorts,
and Timberland boots.
Yeah, and they're just like they're using those old-fashioned Atlas like isometric metal, the spring trainers to get jacked. They're all lubed up. They throw medicine balls back and forth.
It's funny because like only a former Marine is up to the task of like the physical rigors of sexing Elizabeth Warren.
Absolutely. No, you need to be at peak cardio. You need to have significant military training.
You need to have gone through Paris Island.
Absolutely.
Now, help me out here. What kind of Marine are we dealing with here? Is this like one of those TikTok Marines who's always like...
I guarantee you he is a TikTok Marine. There's no question that he is not.
Yeah, what branch of Marine
TikToker.
is he? What class?
He is-
TikTok guy,
he is
divorce guy?
He's in the TikTok.
Sex guy.
Yeah.
No, sex worker. The Marines have a unit dedicated to that.
Oh, okay. Hot Marine.
Yeah, exactly. Stud.
Yeah.
He's in
Wohl.
the stud brigade. All right. Well, sorry about that. This is important. There's important news happening in this country too. But there is an election going on in Canada, and that's why we've brought Donald to introduce us to this issue.
Yeah.
And Luke to take more of a deep dive into it. So, Luke, why don't you begin with just like a quick overview of like where the election stands right now, who are the contenders, and what does the polling seem to indicate?
And if you could also, in that explanation, say use our presidential candidates to explain your candidates, that would be immensely helpful.
I feel like a certain amount of that will be necessary, but to explain Canada, the problem is, Canada does have a kind of bizarre and quite unique political culture, so the analogies won't always be perfect, but I'll do my best. There's the incumbent Liberal Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Obviously, you've no doubt heard about some of his recent exploits.
Mm-hmm. He's a very theatrical fellow.
Yeah, very much so. He's kind of
he commits to certain character.
Yeah, very much. He's a kind of international brand, kind of walking listicle, who's been with us for the last few years. He won election in 2015, and then you've got the Conservative Party led by Andrew Scheer, who was kind of a compromise candidate. They wanted the wackier one, but they had a weird voting system, so Andrew Scheer won.
Who was the wackier one?
We're gonna get to him in a second. He's also leading a political party.
But wait, wasn't there also? I remember when this happened earlier. There was a chance that Canada was going to follow in our footsteps of having a rich TV reality show dickhead become a party leader, because the guy from Shark Tank made an attempt to be the Conservative Party leader, right? Mr. Wonderful.
That's right. Kevin O'Leary tried to run for leader of the Conservative Party, and actually, it seemed like having declared his candidacy, he spent a lot of time just like traveling around the United States and not really campaigning at all. So because of the obvious Trump parallel, a lot of people freaked out in Canada, and they were like, oh God, it's happening here. And there were a bunch of conservative candidates that tried to kind of emulate Donald Trump's style. There was one who started putting like exclamation marks at the end of her tweets. And she started talking about how we're going to drain the canal, referring to the Rideau Canal in Ottawa, which is near the Parliament buildings. But none of that really caught on. And Andrew Scheer ended up winning the leadership. He's about as interesting as watching paint dry. And he was the Speaker of the House of Commons for many years. And when he stopped being Speaker, it turned out he was just like a pretty run of the mill, social and fiscal conservative. The Conservatives are running on kind of the usual suite of like dueling tax credits that they have with the Liberals. Not very interesting. But the guy who was kind of the first choice of Conservative Party members, Maxime Bernier, who is a former foreign minister, he is leading what's now called the People's Party of Canada. This is the first election they've contested. And it's much more of the kind of, it's much more obviously a kind of far right formation. I think, they've kind of hemorrhaged some candidates. They've had trouble finding candidates. I think a few candidates left because they were like, oh God, there seemed to be a lot of racists here. Mm-hmm. He's in the running. It's not clear how much they're catching on. Then you've got the Green Party, which is sort of, as Donald said in his intro, they're kind of a not left, not right before. They sometimes get mistaken for a kind of left of center party. And it's not that they're cryptically right wing. They're just kind of not really anything. If in downtown Toronto, a lot of their candidates would be sort of, urban progressive, bicycle riding types. And then they would also have candidates that are the type of people that have made a whole bunch of dodgy comments on abortion and post like 9/11 conspiracy videos on Facebook and stuff like that. And they're kind of a leader centric brand. They've had the same leader for quite some time. Her name's Elizabeth May, and it is kind of the Elizabeth May party in some ways. And then you've got the NDP, which is kind of one of the places I got my political start, I guess 10 or 11 years ago when I was kind of first getting involved in politics. It's Canada's social democratic party. It comes out of the prairie populism and the kind of radical Methodist Christianity of kind of the early 20th century. It was kind of founded as a coalition. Its predecessor, the CCF, was kind of a coalition of farmers, industrial workers, and socialist intellectuals. They merged with the Canadian Labour Congress in the early 60s to create the NDP. The NDP is kind of the social democratic option in Canada these days. So those are kind of the play. Oh, and then, God, there are so many parties this election. There's also the Bloc Québécois, who are the kind of federal wing of the Quebec sovereignty movement. Shouldn't leave them out.
I guess, in thinking about all this, Americans, sort of certainly liberal Americans, have a kind of stereotype about Canada that it is the nice country that we all wish we could live in because people are polite and, there's some kind of a decent healthcare system.
Yeah.
But overall, that's not really the case. I mean, Canada is almost as reactionary a shithole as America is, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the American caricature, right, is that because Canada is such a small country, the way that other countries see us is sort of as important to our identity as any kind of organic identity that we might have. So, a lot of people abroad think of Canada as this sort of post-racial Scandinavia or something like that. And that's kind of what a lot of Canadians think too. Our official identity is very much that we're this sort of progressive multicultural utopia.
Your formal multiculturalist policy.
Yeah, there is. There's state, it is state policy, as is bilingualism. And I mean, I shouldn't, downplay, there are obviously, multiculturalism in Canada, I think, has been more successful than, in many other countries. There are definitely strengths to making it kind of a part of the civic identity. But the flip side is that I think Canadians are not very good at introspecting about, the deficiencies and the problems in their own society. And so it can kind of end up being a sort of, institutionalized complacency.
So it's Trudeau is the incumbent, right? And Trudeau's a guy who came to power after nearly a decade of rule by a right-wing government led by Stephen Harper, who I think you've described as like the angry hockey dad vote, like that's his constituency, that's who he is and who he represents, right?
Yeah, very much so. So the Conservative Party, I mean, they have a lot of rural support, but, Stephen Harper's majority government in 2011 was kind of won on the backs of suburban voters and, especially the Greater Toronto area. But yeah, the roots of Trudeauism definitely go back to the Harper era. And, in retrospect, looking back at that time, like when the Conservatives, when they'd just been in power for a few years, I was starting university and I kind of saw the birth of the political identity that I think ended up blossoming into Trudeauism, which, again, in retrospect was kind of our own sort of meeker, more provincial version of what is now the, anti-Trump resistance.
Yeah.
The Harper years, they gave birth to this political identity that was sort of, I guess you could say small p progressive. And it was very shrill and kind of hyperbolic about the Conservative Party. So, I remember all these kind of memes circa 2007, 2008 about like, warning signs of fascism or whatever, that kind of thing. But there wasn't really there. You guys know the type. So, and it was ultimately like very focused on all the norms and the institutions whose dignity the Conservatives were supposedly insulting. It was very into using the language of patriotism, to talking about the Constitution, and all of it really was just about being, anti-conservative. Like ABC, anything but conservative, was a label that people actually used and which voters actually kind of assigned to themselves. It didn't really have a program attached to it. It wasn't about replacing Harper with anything in particular. It was just about, replacing him, period. So even though its kind of language was progressive, I think ultimately what the people who were attracted to that wanted was a sort of conservative restoration, which is like very much the case for like a Joe Biden presidency right now.
It sounds a bit
it's
like
very analogous to that.
It sounds like a kind of a woke Blairism. It's funny you make that parallel to the sorts of figures we have in the United States: wine moms, epic rant dads, the denizens of the anti-Trump online resistance, and they love Trudeau. They idolize him in the way that they love Macron, because they, whenever Trudeau sits down with Trump, they analyze the footage for evidence of shade that Trudeau is throwing at Trump.
Well, Luke, like I was going to say, like another huge parallel between Trudeau and these types of people, or at least stylistically, is the intense horniness for him among a certain segment of the population. Like it's just always about like how suave and hot he is. And like that plays it's a big part of his appeal, especially like with the contrast with Donald Trump.
You're saying like that appeal is it's mostly like cultural, and just the production of a reaction against Harper, but without any kind of ideological content, just a sort of worshiping of the image. Because at the end of the day, Justin Trudeau is just the failed son of a former prime minister. He's just a celebrity.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few things at work here. I mean, I think, one of them is, as you mentioned, kind of the horniness, and like more broadly, Trudeau is just, in some ways the product of like an oversaturated, social media driven and like celebrity obsessive culture. He's the political equivalent. He offers people tweet uplift in the way that like something like Upworthy did. If you guys remember that, like awful website. It was like, it's like, Upworthy plus like traditional centrist politics. So that's part of it, right? Like he had viral potential. And, after he got elected, there were headlines, that were things like, Justin Trudeau's 7 secrets to being extraordinarily charming, or, meet the Prime Minister of Canada, our new man crush. These are actual headlines. This was one I liked. Canadian PM Justin Trudeau is really, really ridiculously good looking. And yes, it matters.
So when, as obsessed as you all are with American politics, I mean, Trump meeting Trudeau is obviously a big event. And do you agree with the analysis from our libs that, Justin Trudeau threw some epic shade and made Donald Trump look like a little boy? Is that how you perceive these meetings?
Well, not me personally, but I can tell you that lots of people in Canada absolutely received them that kind of way. Back in 2017, when Trudeau visited the White House, there was this hilarious moment where I guess Trudeau and Trump had some kind of press conference, I guess in the Oval Office or somewhere in the White House, and there's a still image where Trump is holding his outstretched hand. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but Trump is holding his outstretched hand and Trudeau is just kind of looking at it.
I can't see Donald Trump's outstretched hand unless I have a microscope.
Right. Yeah, he's orange too. But yeah, so, in the still image, Trudeau is like, looking like he's just kind of, caustically gazing down at Trump's hand and sort of in defiance, not shaking it. But of course, like seconds later, he's just like smiling for the cameras and shaking Trump's hand. So this is like exactly the same as, when Nancy Pelosi epically throws shade by, kind of cryptically, sassily clapping at Trump during the State of the Union address. And then people have to do sort of alchemy and divination to invent ways that this is somehow like a brave act of defiance. That's very much what the Trudeau brand as kind of a defier of Trump is about. It's about things like that.
So the big question I have is, we know the Trudeau demographic, both here in the United States and in Canada, what the liberal base is now. Is Trump standing among the epic rant dads and the wine moms hurt or helped by doing blackface for his entire life?
The reactions to that, it's not exactly clear. I think it's an indictment of, the electorate that it hasn't instantly cut into, the liberal numbers in the polls. It does seem to be hurting Trudeau's personal ratings, right? I mean, it's the ultimate inversion of his brand as the ultimate performative woke guy.
Yeah.
But I mean, so far it does not. It has as of yet it has not really hurt his the liberal reelection campaign. And what's amazing is that he's basically trying to run a very similar campaign to the one he ran in 2015, like post blackface. I mean, I guess they're making less of an effort to pretend to be progressive, but they're running, he's still showing up at press conferences like in a canoe, like paddling up to the shore in a canoe and things like that. He's still doing all the same.
But how do they? I mean, how do they resolve this cognitive dissonance? When
very carefully.
Originally
if I can walk to that one, motherfucker.
Originally, the dissonance was here's the guy who's very performatively woke and he wears all the costumes and he feels your pain and all that shit. Pretends to care about indigenous people or the plight of others overseas while selling arms to Saudi Arabia and trampling over indigenous land rights and so on and so forth. Ontarians, what do we call them? The LaCroix Ontarians.
I don't care, dude.
Yeah. I guess that never troubled them, but surely now that it's an image that's maddening to them, surely that will cause their brains to finally explode. That there's blackface plus woke guy.
It's pretty extraordinary. Like the Trudeau brand does have a remarkable capacity to recover, because it turns out that, I know it'll surprise you guys, but that a lot of people who talk endlessly about social justice kind of bend on it pretty quickly as soon as their own standards become inconvenient.
Yeah.
The sort of media cycle after the scandal broke, he came out and he kind of did an apology and he said I didn't know that this stuff hurt people. And he was asked by the media, well, did you do it? Did you do it any more than once? And he said, well, there was a time in a high school talent show when I did it. And I also sang Deo. And then they said, and I'm pretty sure at that press conference, he was also asked, well, were there any other times? And he said no. But then the next morning, Global News got a video showing a third instance of him doing it. And, after that, he said, I'm wary of being definitive about this because recent pictures that came out, I had not remembered. And the question is, how can you not remember that?
The thing is, this isn't just the answer is because he's done it so many times. It's just
or the answer is that when it happens, he goes into a fugue state is sort of like the Incredible Hulk. And
It's
then,
like the woke version of not criminally responsible.
Yeah, he doesn't remember it.
But
and he didn't know
I'm
it
saying
did
that it's one thing if this is a grainy yearbook photo that came out. This is the son of the former prime minister, and he's in full body blackface. Like
Right, and he was in his 30s, and he was a teacher at
In
the
his
school where this
30s?
happened. I mean, yeah.
I didn't even know that
no,
part.
absolutely.
I think we've just discovered our first, fracture between American and Canadian politics, because the idea that in America you could be like representing a liberal constituency of a major political party running for the leadership of the country after crassly pretending to be like not another race for most of your life and get away with it is just unthinkable here.
It's not really clear how this didn't come out before because there were lots of people at these events. I mean, one of the videos is dated from the early 90s, so it goes further back. But all of these things seem to have happened before he got into politics. But it is kind of a wonder that this didn't come out before. And I mean, one of the things about Trudeau's brand is that it's always been treated as sort of too big to fail. Like whenever he's kind of deviated from what his image is on paper, which is like the ultra woke performative guy, everyone just kind of ignores it, right? So like in his big Rolling Stone interview, which I think came out in 2017, something like that, he's talking about this ridiculous charity boxing match that was kind of one of the things that, as absurd as it sounds, kind of elevated him nationally. And he was in politics at this point. And his opponent in that match was this indigenous senator. And he says in the interview, he just straight up says, I wanted someone who would be a good foil. And we stumbled upon the scrappy, tough guy senator from an indigenous community. He fit the bill, and it was a very nice counterpoint. And so he was, raked over the coals by, indigenous activists over that. But it was just kind of ignored, just like it was ignored in the 2015 federal election, when in an interview, he seemed to account for violence against women by blaming rap music. People just sort of always overlooked that kind of thing.
No, so nobody knew about the blackface beforehand when you're telling me he was, this was in the context of a class or a live performance. So theoretically, hundreds of people like just saw him in blackface and forgot about it.
Yeah, I guess so.
Going further into Trudeau, you wrote a very good article in Current Affairs about Trudeau called Justin Trudeau and the Politics of Spectacle. But these parallels emerge again because, he comes into office after, like a decade of a right-wing government. Like he's young, he's good looking, he seems to embody the hopes of a younger generation and a desire to sort of shift course, right? And, exactly like Obama did. And everyone, myself included, felt positive at that moment. But then, you go into it and, right off the bat, you talk about, what are some of the things he ran on that, again, as soon as he got in office, immediately backed off on?
Yeah, so it was very much like Obama in that a lot of people who thought, who voted liberal thought that they were voting for anti-war, tax the rich kind of government, and needless to say, that's not what they got. I guess Trudeau's political skill, insofar as he had one, was that he was able to kind of adopt progressive language while not really. He wasn't in retro. I mean, as with Obama, right? Like Obama was going around in 2008 praising Ronald Reagan, but none of us kind of noticed or cared. We all thought that he was. Kind of a figure of the left in some way, and Trudeau,
or that he was doing it to be politically canny and assuage moderates' instincts, or about that him as some sort of wild foreign radical or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. It was all part of the 24-dimensional game of chess, which I guess Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have now taken up. I don't know what move they're on at this point, but yeah. So it was, it was the liberal platform, had all this kind of, I guess, softly left language around, taxing the rich, doing deficit spending, on around indigenous rights, around climate change. And I mean, if you actually looked into the details, there was nothing particularly radical about it. I mean, they're running to the right of the NDP definitely. But, Trudeau, kind of ingeniously towed the line. And I think that, Trudeau himself is not a very interesting figure because he's exactly as you see him. He's, a trust fund kid who grew up rich and famous and then, kind of inherited political power largely on the basis of his last name. But the Trudeau phenomenon, I think, is interesting in some ways because at a time when, liberalism was just kind of taking L's everywhere, when, populism, particularly of the right wing variety, was on the rise all over the world, the Trudeau liberals kind of found the perfect formula. They figured out how you could kind of you could speak to the concerns of working and middle class people who were concerned about inequality and climate change and things like that. But you could also reassure the global elite, the people who are afraid of populism, that you weren't actually really going to do anything. And
that sounds kind of familiar.
So one of the reasons why Trudeau became an international brand is because so many traditional political actors, like centrists in other countries, basically looked at this and they thought, God, how do we copy this? This is absolute genius. And Trudeau was just the perfect package for this because he had the veneer of youth. But I mean, essentially he was cashing in on sort of, baby boomer nostalgia for, the era of his dad, which was like Canada in the, the swinging 60s. So it was, it was the perfect, electoral brand. It was, kind of a message that was ultimately about a conservative restoration, but with sort of an aura of novelty attached to it. They figured out a way to give traditional political power a veneer of social conscience at a time when liberals everywhere else were, had completely lost it when it came to doing that and winning elections.
And speaking to this, I guess one of the most galling things, both from the perspective of his, sort of woke branding, but also actual moral and political commitments, is the issue of First Nations and Indigenous land rights in Canada. He had some proposal that would give First Nations communities total veto power over land leases and cultivation of their land, basically. What happened with that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so that was abandoned because I guess the need to build pipelines is just too important.
So it was abandoned when it was realized this will prevent the other thing we wanted to.
It
was abandoned when they realized they might exercise those powers we might give them.
Yeah, that's right. And there was another thing. They were going to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They actually went to the United Nations and announced that, and they were like, the time is now, and then a couple months later, they were like, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that.
Or I believe the quote that you have is that they said that this just isn't workable.
That's right. Yeah.
Which
sort of begs the question, why did they promise to do it in the first place?
Speaking of pipelines, didn't that motherfucker march in the climate strike?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's
he marched against himself.
Yeah.
Luke, what has the Liberal government done then? What have they delivered on?
Insofar as they actually committed to do anything specific, they've flip-flopped on a lot of the big specific commitments. So they were also going to change Canada's electoral system. They just dropped that. We have an archaic 19th century electoral system where people
that
win.
Must suck.
100,
19th century.
Sorry about that, dude.
Fuck off.
It's not. Yeah,
I kill for a 19th century electoral system.
It's not as bad as yours, admittedly, but it's pretty bad. You can basically get 100% of the legislative power with as little as 34 or 35% of the popular vote, which maybe that could benefit a left-wing party someday. That would be great, but mostly it hasn't done that. But so, yeah, they abandoned electoral reform. They were also going to raise taxes on the rich, which, officially they did do that. They created a new tax bracket for, I think it was incomes above $200,000. But then they also cut taxes for the income tax bracket below. So it's actually a net tax cut. And the most of the gains, or the majority of the gains, went to the top 10% of earners. So it's just a total sleight of hand. It's the kind of thing you can imagine like the Center for American Progress coming up with or something. I mean, they did create a child benefit, which I guess is like a means tested grant that goes disproportionately to low income families. The problem with that was that they advanced it kind of explicitly in opposition to a universal childcare program. The liberals, just like the Democrats, like love means testing.
What about refugees and migration?
Yeah, so I mean, the rhetoric around refugees was certainly, much better than anything coming out of the United States. I mean, the NDP in 2015 had a more ambitious program to admit more refugees, which the Liberals attacked the NDP program and then essentially ended up adopting it. I'm actually kind of forgetting the details. It's been a few years. So Trudeau, at least did make a kind of an effort to symbolically, embrace the refugee issue. And he tweeted a number of things that I guess were cryptically interpreted as condemnations of Trump. But Canada took, I think a decent number of refugees, but like many fewer per capita than, other countries, I think particularly those in Scandinavia. And I mean, when it comes to actually, updating border policy, I mean, Canadian authorities are still cooperating with, your own border authorities and things like that. So I think very little has changed there.
What you get at in the current affairs piece is that like Trudeau as a political model, like sort of picking up the ball from Obama and running with it. Like what's attractive to you about it is that like, you have the look of a guy who's
black,
who's POC occasionally, but but also like it represents kind of a wholesome, unthreatening masculinity. We have one article here from when he was first election. Justin Trudeau's election redefined politics of manliness, study suggests, and this is an academic study which purports to claim that Justin Trudeau's he's hot, he's jacked, but he also has feelings and has a boyish sort of demeanor. But more importantly, it's this thing about like his politics are about saying things in such a way that reassures all involved that he's one of you without actually saying or committing to anything, and really reassuring, party elites and the wealthy that he's not going to rock the boat, right? And you have
very much so.
And there's one quote here again that we're like sometimes, like you said, like the mask slips or like the algorithm breaks down a little bit, and like too much of what he's actually talking about gets through. So he says here, this was in response to a question. You write about how his government was navigating the unpopularity of neoliberal globalization at the present political moment. And he said this, quote, "We were able to sign a free trade agreement with Europe at a time when people tend to be closing off. We're actually able to approve pipelines at a time when everyone wants protection of the environment. We're being able to show that we get people's fears and there are constructive ways of allaying them, and not just ways to lash out and give a big kick to the system." So what he's really saying is like, my politics is about allaying people's fears about the things that I'm doing.
That's right. And I mean, as with Obama, that was always, that was always clear. That was always something he made explicit from the beginning. There was an op-ed that he published. I can't remember in which newspaper it was published. I think in 2013, 2014, something like that. And this was when he was laying out what was supposedly the Liberals' like anti-inequality agenda. And he said, national business leaders and other wealthy Canadians should draw the following conclusion, and do so urgently. If we do not solve, the problems facing the middle class and low income earners, and these are Trudeau's words, Canadians will eventually withdraw their support for a growth agenda. We will all be worse off. As a consequence, deepening anxiety yields deepening divisions, and people will begin to vote for leaders who offer comforting stories about who to blame for our problems rather than how to solve them. So he's basically addressing business leaders and people like that. And he was saying, hey, look, I get it. You don't want to pay higher taxes, but we got to give people something. We got to at least show that, we got to at least pretend to do something, because otherwise, as he puts it, Canadians may withdraw their support for a growth agenda, which is another way of saying, they might vote for people who will actually raise your taxes. And we can't allow that.
No, yeah, you have to allay people's fears, because if they have all this fear and anxiety, then they won't sign on to the pro-growth. So he's just saying, go with me. I'm going to allay the dum-dums' fears, and we can still get all the growth that we all want.
Very much so, yeah.
Well, so that's Trudeau. What about the NDP, the ostensible left option?
Yeah, so the NDP, I think in this election is, it's moved to the left of where it was last time. The NDP platform last time had a number of decent things in it, but it had this really numbskulled pledge to run balanced budgets, which kind of neutered the other stuff. So this time, the NDP is not doing that. There's the NDP is kind of hard to place relative to other left parties worldwide, just because the political culture here is so different. But so it's I don't think you see a lot of stuff that's kind of maybe as radical as things that Bernie Sanders is proposing, or some of the stuff that's coming out of British Labour. I'd like to see the NDP be a lot bolder on foreign policy in particular. I'd love to see it embrace some of the stuff around worker ownership and, economic democracy that's coming out of both Britain and the United States right now. But there is some pretty good stuff in the program. In the platform, there's a wealth tax. There's a national childcare program. I think, as actually was mentioned in the intro, there's, expanding Medicare, because our healthcare system was actually designed in the 1960s. So it doesn't cover all kinds of things. It doesn't cover pharmaceutical drugs. It doesn't cover dental. So expanding it to pay for that. It's basically a social democratic document with a bit of populism thrown in. I think that Canadian political culture has always been defined by the Liberals. It's always kind of been a politics of elite brokerage that happens in the political center. And class politics, while it's existed here, has always been sort of a more marginal force. Even when populism has expressed itself historically, it's expressed itself through regional identities. So, it's the populism of the prairies or of Alberta, where kind of right-wing populism in Canada is based, or it's the populism of, the Quebec sovereignty movement. And so the kind of basic left-right split that happened in most countries sometime in the 20th century never really happened in Canada. And so we're left with kind of this, peculiar political dynamic where we have a fake left-wing party that's actually, party of the neoliberal center-right. We have now, I guess, two conservative parties, and then we have a social democratic party that sort of straddles, center-left respectability and, genuine social democracy.
What do you make of their candidate, Jagmeet Singh?
Yeah, so he's definitely to the left of the previous leader, Thomas Mulcair, who was running on balanced budgets, and
Richard Karn looking motherfucker.
I'm sorry,
he looked like the guy from Home Improvement. Richard Karns, look him up. Al Borland.
You.
So people say I look like.
Yeah, so Jagmeet Singh has showed some signs of there's some bold things that he's proposed. So there's when he was running for the leadership, he talked about the need to decriminalize drugs and declare the opioid epidemic, which is something it's really, really serious all over Canada. Declare that a national emergency. As you would expect, having a racialized leader of a political party has kind of unleashed the floodgates of racism have opened right away as soon as he became.
Yeah,
leader.
He's a Sikh. He wears a turban. He's campaigning he's visibly a member of a racial and religious minority.
Yeah, that's right. So just yesterday alone, like in the morning, he was at a market in Montreal campaigning, and a guy came up to him and said, "You should really cut off your turban so you look like a Canadian." And then in the evening, after the televised French language debate, the Bloc Québécois, their Twitter account, I mean, this is like a rough translation I got from Twitter, but they tweeted something like, the future is yours. Opt for men and women who look like you, who share your values, who care about your concerns, blah, blah, blah. And then it ends rather ominously with the words, tomorrow belongs to you.
I've heard that phrase somewhere before. I mean, that's rich coming from them. I mean, why don't they fucking speak English, you know? Why don't they just speak the language of Canadians? What's all this French shit?
Luke, do you speak French?
I do not. I mean, so I was taught French from grade. I was taught French from the 3rd grade up until grade 11 because as part of official bilingualism in Canada, you are taught it in public schools, but they sort of teach it, unless you're in French immersion, they sort of teach it with the assumption that you're not really learning it. So you learn vocabulary and you learn how to conjugate verbs, and I don't really remember much of either. Outside of, I mean, parts of Quebec are genuinely bilingual, and so is Ottawa. A few parts of Ontario, but besides that, bilingualism is sort of it's something that exists much more institutionally, I think, than as kind of a lived reality.
And how would you describe like the NDP in this election? How would you describe like their voting base, or like the people who support them?
It's a mix of the kind of traditional working class, insofar as that still exists as a social base, union workers, things like that. People in the parts of Ontario that, used to have large industrial, manufacturing industries, things like that, cars and industries like that. But it's also kind of urban progressives. So in, downtown Toronto, Vancouver, places like that. And after 2011, the NDP kind of developed a foothold in Quebec, which is something that had long eluded it. Quebec is actually, in some ways, much more culturally and politically social democratic than the rest of Canada. But because the sovereignty issue has historically been so big there, the NDP was never able to achieve a breakthrough. And in 2011, it finally did. It lost some of those seats in 2015, but still maintained a few of them. And so Quebec is definitely a part of the NDP coalition as well.
And how is are the NDP, how are they polling in this election?
The polls right now just don't look very good across the board. I mean, I think the last one I saw, the Conservatives were actually a little bit ahead. The Liberals are not that far behind, and the NDP is kind of neck and neck with the Green Party in the last polls I saw in the low teens. So not too great at the moment. But I think the caveat I'd issue is that even though the election's kind of at the halfway point, Canadian elections are very short. And to be honest, I don't get the sense that a lot of people have really been paying that much attention. There hasn't been a big televised debate involving all of the leaders in English yet. And I think there's still the potential for possibly some pretty big swings. I mean, I'm hesitant to make predictions after the presidential election in 2016, but I'm not sure the outcome is yet to be determined. I think a lot of people are still undecided, and I think there may be a sort of delayed reaction in the polls to the Trudeau blackface scandal.
Do you think that's going to help him in Quebec?
Trudeau or the NDP?
Trudeau.
I don't think it necessarily will. I mean, the main thing the Liberals, I mean, I don't think it will help them. I think it will, it's a drag wherever they go. I mean, I was actually at a local debate the other night, and the incumbent Liberal MP didn't mention Justin Trudeau's name a single time, which I thought was pretty revealing. So he's gone from being their biggest asset to a pretty big drag.
So as this election is shaping up, what is the Conservatives and Scheer's pitch to get back in power?
It's a very boring one. I mean, it's and actually before the Trudeau blackface scandal broke, the election really did seem like it was just going to be sort of the Liberals and the Conservatives dueling on very similar appeals to, suburban Canada, to kind of the middle of the middle. I mean, the conservative base is, very it's a lot of it's very similar to the MAGA people, and probably, honestly, a lot, there's probably a big crossover, like MAGA Facebook groups and, Canadian conservative Facebook groups, things like that.
And the people who call him Justine Trudeau.
Yeah, exactly. But the actual Conservative Party pitch is an incredibly boring one. It's always, and I think it's one that it's the same one they've pushed for a long time, and it's one that ultimately ends up, kind of helping the Liberals in some ways, because they always portray the Liberals as these like tax and spend, big government, socialists or whatever. And that kind of helps the Liberals, because that's kind of how they want certain people to think, to think about them. But the Conservatives, tend to downplay their, the worst parts of their base during the election. And then, they kind of run on this very boring, like suburban identity politics that's, tax credits and giving people tax relief from the supposedly crippling tax burden being imposed by, Justin Trudeau and his, finance minister who hails from Bay Street, which is like our Wall Street.
And there's a lot of regional resentment there, too. The Liberals, you don't want Ontario Liberals running the show or your tax dollars going there.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, regional identity politics are sort of those have been the fulcrum of like Canadian federal politics for quite some time.
Well, if the Conservatives are boring, what about your new Nazi party? That's got to be fun, right?
So, yeah, I mean, they're interesting. So the People's Party, which is being led by Maxime Bernier, they are the first attempt, I guess, since the 1990s to do like a harder right, like an openly harder right Conservative Party. Maxime Bernier was a Conservative MP and also a cabinet minister for like during the Harper era. And he was actually the first choice of Conservative Party members. On the first ballot, he actually got more votes than Andrew Scheer, I guess 2 years ago when they had their leadership convention. But because of their convoluted voting system, he ended up losing. And then he left, and started this new political party, the People's Party, which I think is more openly of the MAGA variety. But he's an interesting figure in that he was treated by our kind of mostly center-right punditry for over a decade as this sort of respectable wonk. He was the policy-focused guy. His boutique issue, which is a big one for some reason for conservatives in Canada, is deregulating the dairy market. So ending supply management is the kind of popular phrase.
He, and I might be confusing him with someone else, but wasn't he involved in this sex scandal like 15 years ago?
Well, when he was foreign minister, the thing that got him turfed as foreign minister was that he left some important documents at the house of a woman that I guess he was seeing at the time, and it turned out that she had some ties to the Hells Angels, so he was out as foreign minister. That might be what you're thinking about.
She wrote like a book about it on the eve of an election.
I confess I haven't read it, but that sounds right. I think that did happen. But anyway, he was the boutique. He was the Paul Ryan of Canadian politics.
He was the horny one.
He was the guy that, he talked about deregulating the dairy market, and everyone decided that he was a wonk. And it turns out that, he and the political party he founded are extremely racist. Who'd have thought?
So how was the Groyper block doing?
Right there.
Well, so the Greens... So the Greens have gone into the election, I guess, with kind of high hopes. They, I guess, won a by-election 6 or 7 months ago, which I think is only the second MP they've ever elected. They've never really been a big force in Canadian politics. So they're polling, I think, around 10% right now, which is higher than they usually do. But the Green Party has always polled better during elections than it polls on election day. The honest truth about Canadian politics is that any party that can kind of position itself as the anti-conservative party often wins or is often kind of the beneficiary of all the votes that are, to the left of the of the hard right, because there's maybe 60% of the Canadian electorate, maybe a little less than that, who would probably never consider voting Conservative. And they tend to kind of vote in a wave. And that was very much the wave that elected Trudeau in 2015. So I would be surprised if the Greens elect more than one or two MPs.
I guess just like overall though, like outside of like the NDP, like how do you see, like what do you see as the horizons for left-wing politics in Canada? You mentioned that there are these, nascent and somewhat promising politicians and energy in America and the UK. How do you see that in Canada, like outside of one election or the other?
I mean, there are a lot of kind of disparate, activist movements in Canada, and what no one's figured out yet is kind of how to cohere them together. There are lots of people that are involved in those movements, so who are organizers around criminal justice issues or environmental stuff. Or wage fairness, whatever. There are a lot of people like that who, involve themselves in the NDP, who are maybe running as NDP candidates. But I think it's safe to say that it hasn't really cohered into, a coherent alternative yet. The reasons for that, I think, are kind of complex. They're partly political, but they're also partly cultural. This is one sense in which the stereotypes about Canada are kind of true. We have a sort of meeker political culture that is a bit tamer and has not been, I think, as prone to populism or to kind of the rhetoric of revolution as the United States or kind of European, various European countries. I think nonetheless, so the horizons for the left, I hope are pretty bright. I think and hope that they are. I think that, one of the reasons why, I am a little more sympathetic to the NDP than, some others maybe on the radical left in Canada is that I think that because I do a lot of work in the United States where it's a struggle to get the nominal left of center party to even embrace Medicare for all. It's taken years of organizing to even kind of make that an issue in the Democratic primaries. To me, there's a lot of value in just having a social democratic party that's affiliated with trade unions, that has roots in the working class. And I think that, there's potential for the NDP to morph into something a little more disruptive and radical than it is, currently. With the caveat that I think, the current NDP platform is not bad. And, there's some good candidates running. I'll certainly be working to try to get a few of them elected here in Toronto.
Just a couple quick things before we go. You mentioned earlier the sort of regional identity politics that play into this, into Canadian politics. Could you just briefly describe for us, what are these identity types and the places that they live?
Yeah, so I mean, historically, these have been some of the big, determining forces in Canadian politics. So Canadian politics for, decades, if not longer, was very much anchored in Ontario and Quebec, and in Toronto and Montreal specifically. And over the course of the 20th century, you had, various kind of populist movements of different kinds kind of rise up against the Eastern Canadian establishment. So in the 1930s, you had the beginnings of kind of, class and labor politics in Canada, or 1920s and 30s, with, these kind of, agrarian populists that came from, places like Saskatchewan. That's where North America elected its first social democratic government in 1944, which was a CCF government. But then there's also been right-wing populism that's come from further west on the prairies. So Alberta, has kind of been the home of, the most hard right politicians in Canada. And it's where a fair number of kind of a fair amount of the right-wing, the movement conservative infrastructure is. So there's that. And then there's been, the seismic force of Quebec sovereigntism, which, before the 1950s, Quebec was almost a kind of colony of, English Canada and a handful of American corporations. It was heavily controlled by the Catholic Church. But then in the 50s and 60s, there was this seismic cultural shift that people call the Quiet Revolution, where Quebec became, this radically secular kind of social democratic society. And then people in Quebec were very split about where to take that next. Some people decided that Quebec really needed to become its own country. And then others, including Justin Trudeau's dad, Pierre Trudeau, thought that, Quebec should kind of assert itself within Canada. And so that's where we got kind of official bilingualism and things like that. And then I guess, Atlantic Canada, there are a bunch of smaller provinces out there, and they all have very strong identities, as well. So, identity politics in Canada of a kind have been, really big determining factors in Canadian, federal politics.
Leave it to Canada to have something called a quiet revolution.
But from 2019, a left-wing perspective, what in your mind is the correct line on the Quebecois sovereignty and separatism issue? Is this a noble self-determination against a colonial project of the crown and capital, or is this just like a vulgar base nationalism of the worst kind?
I mean, you would get very different answers depending on who you asked. I think I basically have, I'm kind of a small D Democrat. So I think that, Quebecers, like the Scots, have a right to self-determination. But I mean, I think if you go to Quebec, you'll find that it very much has the feeling of being a distinct society already. I've never, I think as long as kind of the distinctness of French Canada is recognized, I'm not really sure it needs to be a distinct country. That's my opinion, but others might.
They need to pipe the fuck down. That's the takeaway. The least aggrieved motherfuckers on earth. Settle down.
If you asked most Canadian pundits, like in English Canada, that's what they would say.
Eat your goddamn cheese and shut the fuck up. You think France wants any part of your asses? They think you're a bunch of hillbillies. You fucking eat potatoes and French fries and gravy.
It's good.
Yeah, sure, but it's not French. You like hockey, for God's sake.
Just while we're wrapping up everything, what's going on with the other Ford? The one, the clown prince of Toronto's brother,
the one who survived,
the one who lived. The other drug dealer.
He's wreaking havoc. I mean, the Ontario actually has a really right-wing government now. It's actually, I guess I probably should have brought that up before. But I guess the good news about Doug is that he's extremely unpopular because he didn't really run on the hard right. He kind of ran as like it's just time for change because the Liberals have been in power for too long. And he said, no one's going to lose their job. Everything's going to work better. You're going to pay lower taxes. And he kind of just cruised to victory. But then it turned out that, actually he wanted to do, a kind of, lacerating series of cuts. And, he's trying to do austerity. And turns out that's really unpopular. So that's in brief what's going on with Doug.
Plus, he just doesn't have the raw animal magnetism and just oozing charisma of Rob, so he'll never go quite as far.
Or the incredible gift for oratory that his brother had.
And energy.
This reminds me of one thing. But they both sold drugs when they were kids. Okay. Like, that's true, right? Like, they were a drug-dealing family.
I mean, Doug Ford, according to an investigation by one of Canada's leading newspapers, was one of the main drug dealers in suburban Toronto during the 1980s.
The plug.
And I think a mere week or two before Rob Ford was elected mayor of Toronto, one of the newspapers here got an audio recording of a constituent asking Rob Ford to help get him drugs. And Rob Ford's just kind of being like, all right, buddy, I'll do my best. And he got elected mayor a couple weeks later.
I would vote for the plug. Absolutely. That reminds me of one thing. We can cut this because it's very esoteric and it's obviously old news now. But one thing I remember from when he was running for provincial office was one of his issues was making beer cheaper. Buck a beer? What the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, buck a beer. I think it was mostly a slogan. I think a lot of the breweries kind of came out and said, like that won't really work because you can't actually manufacture beer that's that cheap. I think there might actually be one or two brews that you can get for $1, but it's not really a thing. The reason why that's within the government's jurisdiction at all is actually because alcohol is in Ontario is like a government monopoly. We have if you go buy beer, one of the 2 or 3 places you can get it is actually called the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, which is a hangover from kind of the temperance movement and prohibition.
Well, I think we will leave you guys with this. You sent me this, and I can't stop thinking about it. Trudeau was once on stage with Bill Nye the Science Guy and delivered this quote: "Every human being starts as a scientist. When you're a baby, you're a scientist. If I make this noise, I get milk." So there you go. That is that's the Justin Trudeau platform, which is I'm baby.
That's a good excuse for the blackface too. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, I did blackface, but bear in mind that I am baby.
If you sing Deo, you get to wear this face. We'll see how this experiment plays out. Well, Luke Savage, I want to thank you for joining us and cluing us in on what is going on in our great neighbor to the north. Luke, do you have anything you'd like to plug at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I write for Jacobin, so people can find most of my work these days there. I also have my own podcast, which is kind of a film and politics podcast called Michael and Us that people can find on your podcast app and on Patreon. So check it out if you don't already have enough podcasts to listen to.
Please send us the links.
Will do.
All right, everybody. Luke Savage. Thanks again to Don Hughes, a.k.a. Get Fiscal. Check out their podcast as well. You Can't Win. That does it for today. Bye, Canada.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Love you.
Bye, guys.
Make the same mistakes all over again. Come on now, now, now.